So welcome everyone. Hello, a very warm welcome to you all. It's lovely to see you all today at today's webinar hosted by BioPhorum. So my name is Louisa Mitchell. I am a global change facilitator and I have the pleasure of facilitating the single-use programme at BioPhorum. The focus of today's discussion is supply chain resiliency through single-use system standardisation, and it centres around a paper that was recently published and authored by members of BioPhorum's Design Harmonisation workstream. So again, you're all very welcome today. I'm delighted to welcome our panel of speakers who also authored the publication. We have Monica Cardona, Global Senior Programme Manager, Single-Use Programmes at MilliporeSigma. Vishwas Peth, Principal Engineer, Single-Use Systems at Amgen. Jennifer Gilbert, Single-Use Technologies Strategy Manager for Pfizer, and Kieran McBride, Advisor Engineering at Eli Lilly and Company. And also supporting the webinar today is my colleague and fellow facilitator, Sean Collins. As I mentioned, this webinar is centred around a publication. You can download the publication and many others from biophorum.com using the QR code provided on this slide here. I will show that in a couple of slides' time as well, in case you didn't catch it. Before I hand over to our panel of speakers today, let me briefly introduce BioPhorum for those of you who may not know us yet. We were established in 2008, and BioPhorum is the global collaboration of choice. Our membership includes many of the largest industry organisations, and we have a vast array of ongoing industry collaborations. Our mission is to create an environment where our members can connect, collaborate, and accelerate progress for the benefit of all. BioPhorum members share complicated challenges, whether that be in the process of making biopharma drugs, developing new gene therapies, or licensing a combination product, and we build the best solutions to those challenges together. Our powerful, proven collaboration model makes everyone's journey better, faster, and cheaper. And the decisions that are made in BioPhorum collaborations are highly influential, providing one voice for the industry. Specifically, the single-use programme at BioPhorum encompasses a series of collaborative initiatives, and that harnesses the knowledge and expertise of subject matter experts and thought leaders from our single-use supplier and end-user communities. Collectively, they strive to ensure the robust, safe, and compliant supply, qualification, and application of single-use technologies in the biopharma manufacturing space. So that's a little bit about BioPhorum. Specifically to talk about today's webinar, so it will be presented in 4 sections. Monica will kick us off with some discussion around the benefits and challenges of standardisation from a supplier's perspective. Vishwas will then cover the end user's perspective. Jennifer will then cover the support required within an organisation for successful standardisation, and Kieran will conclude the presentations with considerations for implementation. I've included the QR code for the publication again here. I've also included the QR code for the poll. So again, at the end of each section, we will be posting a poll question. We'd love for you to provide some feedback and thoughts on what's been discussed.
Oh, poll.
Oh,
poll.
Hello. Yeah, we will share the poll results at the end of the session during our Q&A. So you may wish to open the poll now in preparation for the first question at the end of Monica's section. I'm also going to put the link to the poll in the chat, and I see Sean has already kindly done that. Thank you, Sean. So thank you again for your attendance and participation today. I hope you enjoy our presentations. I am now going to hand over to Monica. Thank you, Monica.
Good morning, everyone. Today, I'm going to talk about a supplier's perspective, both some of the benefits and the challenges with respects to single-use standardization. So I thought it appropriate to understand that there is a balance. So one of my favorite quotes is from Henry Ford, and it says, "Any customer can have a car painted any color that he wants, so as long as it's black." And so clearly on our standardization journey, that's a little extreme, right? We can't go to that end of the spectrum. The other quote I have here is a quote from a single-use integrator from 2014. And what they said was, we work with customers to design, develop, and produce custom products. And we provide service from concept and prototype through to production. And what I didn't include in the slide was we have 10,000 components readily available from you to choose from. So the point here is that we have to meet somewhere in the middle. So today, right, with the convergence of automation, intensified continuous and closed processing, single-use technology continues to deliver value. However, the design flexibility and customization of single-use technology has resulted in a proliferation of, at times, very similar, undifferentiated single-use system designs, sometimes within the same user company and even provided by multiple suppliers. So that proliferation of custom designs, has contributed to supply chain complexity that requires significant management and resources from both suppliers and end users. So the goal is, still being able to choose from the latest components while not significantly impacting component inventory management, and having a balance between being able to offer customization and design flexibility, but with the understanding that it's perhaps not needed for every single application. So what are some of the benefits? Now, I want to be very clear in what I'm saying. I'm not saying that automation isn't possible unless there's full standardization. But, to increase CapEx investor in automation, right? To go all in on automation, it does require, a level
Oh,
of
I didn't see your
standardization.
essay, sorry. I saw Thelina ran before you, and I just looked at his data, and the
Can
10 kDa
we
standard was uh,
can we mute the participants, Lisa? Thank you. So, you know, standardized, systems can be more easily integrated into automated processes, and definitely this would, enhance efficiency, reduce need for manual intervention, um, and give us more reproducibility. There's also simplified inventory management, both for an internal and an external supply chain, right? If we improve demand planning and consistency in the stock of components, reduce design time, right? Every time we have a custom design, that you need to do an FMEA engineering design assessment to ensure it complies with your respective supplier's design rules. And these design rules are generally based on experience. The other benefit is this modular pre-configured subassemblies approach. So if we think of, instead of designing from the component level, if we have a bit more of standardization, then you can design single-use assemblies from a sub-assembly level. And what this does is it provides operational flexibility and efficiency, and it also enables us to stock sub-assemblies versus just components. And of course, all of these would have an impact on lead time. However, even if we were, let's say, completely standard today, it's still dependent, right, on the accuracy of the forecast, regardless of whether we're looking at custom or standard assemblies. That aspect of it is still very important. So how do we achieve standardization. I think many industry groups, including BioPhorum, we've attempted on multiple occasions. Even this original work stream was called design harmonization, and we didn't have much success. However, some best practices were identified that, if adopted, can have favorable industry impact to both end users and suppliers because there's benefits to both. The more challenging issue is how to achieve that single-use standardization. So I think that the first step is a successful supplier and user collaboration on standardization to understand each other's goals. So for example, from a supplier perspective, you may want to increase automation in manufacturing, apply more lean manufacturing processes, and a modular subassembly approach to provide these operational flexibility and efficiency. End users may want to have multiple qualified sources for their single-use assemblies, and many have also launched programs for component interchangeability to mitigate supply chain risks. Some end users believe that single-use suppliers should standardize such that all single-use consumables can be used in hardware interchangeably. Unfortunately, right, from a supplier perspective, that level of standardization would just lead to commoditized products, and also it would limit future innovation, right? Because if it's all standard, then right, we want to make sure that there is a balance where we have standardization, where we still have the design flexibility of customization, and we also have room for continued innovation in this space. So for supplier driven, every supplier has tried to contribute to the standardization journey while maintaining flexibility by offering, for example, tiered components, right? All major single-use suppliers have tiered component classification, and based on that classification of components, you would be able to have either improved documentation or better lead times. The idea is, when looking at bringing a single-use assembly onto the facility, it's good at first take a look at the standard systems. All of your single-use suppliers have some level of standard off-the-shelf systems. And then the next option would be become familiar with your respective suppliers' preferred components. And there's many different programs. I think every supplier has their own program. Some have 2 tiers, some have 3 tiers, but ultimately, your supplier's preferred components generally come with the highest level of qualification and documentation. They're usually in stock and have a reduced lead time. When it comes to this modular pre-configured approach, I think this is ultimately where many suppliers are working towards. Some are at different steps of that journey, but this does give time savings in manufacturing, and it also can simplify assembly design. And by no means is custom going away, right? That's not going to happen. But we do need to find the balance between these 4 options, to ensure highest quality, fastest lead time, most cost-effective single-use assemblies. That all being said, driving this, initiating this, and maintaining these types of standardization efforts do require some digital tools. So suppliers, regardless of size, are at varying stages of the automation and data digitization journey. And this does have an impact on how supplier-driven standardization initiatives can be deployed. Um, so while most suppliers do have tiered classification for single-use components, the type of information required for those components, where it's stored, how it's managed, and eventually how it's shared and provided to end users is can be a challenge if you don't have the infrastructure, right, to make sure that the data is readily available for those components. And at the time that you are designing your single-use assembly, you know exactly that you don't design an assembly and then come back and say, oh, wait a minute, that component, I don't have USP 665 extractables data for it, and this is a critical application. So it's the digital tools, right, or smart configurators, accessibility to that information, right? In the best case scenario, the information is stored electronically, it's validated database, it's gated. There could be a self-service end user portal access to the information such that, ideally when an end user is designing, they know whether the components that they're choosing are the supplier's preferred components and would know at the design stage what documentation is available. And then there is interchangeability, and there is a cost associated, right, with interchangeability, and there's varying degrees of interchangeability. So having variable bill of materials and having variable bill of materials means, from a supplier perspective, that we would have to actively purchase and have on the shelf the two interchangeable components so that we can provide them to our end users. So successful and behavioral reinforcement is dependent on digital infrastructure. So, another vision could be, ideally, the end user, having their own databases, right, where they know what assemblies they purchase from which suppliers, and looking at that prior to designing from scratch. But I do feel that, digital tools are a large component for the success of any standardization effort that we may embark on. So regardless of where you are in your standardization journey as a supplier or as an end user, there are end users that have fully digitized their own component databases and have their drawings and are very advanced in that journey. But I think it's a stepwise approach. So if you take anything away from today's discussion, what I would ask is, when looking at your applications, take a look at your supplier standard offering and see if these can be used prior to embarking on a new design. Ideally, look at what you're already purchasing and see if you could purchase more of the same for your new applications. When you do have to design with your supplier's preferred components, because this will give you, the best documentation packages, ideally, the best lead times. And another practice that I've seen work quite well is, periodically, whether it's once a year or twice a year, sit down with your supplier and review your current designs. Sometimes you will see that there is room to rationalize some designs that may be very similar and may, let's say, only differ in slight tubing length or something to that effect. And that's a way to embark on the standardization journey, right? Start with what you have and see if some of those designs can be rationalized. My fellow panelists today have a lot of really good insight in more proactive ways of embarking on your standardization journey.
Thank you, Louisa, and thank you, Monica, for that great perspective on supplier. Before I get into the slides, I briefly wanted to chat a little bit about the design harmonization work stream and how our perspective changed through those discussions. Early on, indeed, the goal was, can we standardize on supplier end to ensure that we can get our assemblies in a relatively shorter lead time at a good quality and so on. And we quickly realized that intellectual property of various supplier technologies prevented us from standardizing across supplier base. But not only that, we also realized that end user requirements are vastly different, and there is no standard that meets each end user's requirement. And we quickly also realized from those discussions that if end users were able to standardize on their own end across a number of their sites, that would allow our suppliers to manufacture assemblies for us at relatively um, uh, shorter lead time and better qualities. With that, I'll walk you through some benefits from standardization exercise. So the goals for suppliers as well as end users through this exercise was to ensure there is reduced lead time and reduced cost involved for single-use assemblies. And some of the benefits we've realized through this work is uh, if you have a standardized single-use assemblies for your manufacturing, you will require reduced resources to implement and maintain those single-use designs. The development of designs, the qualification, and the implementation of those designs, the amount of resources that are required is quite significant. And if you can reduce those number of single-use standards, then you're going to require reasonably less resources. Also, we realized that one of the benefits of standardization is reduced complexity of single-use systems, resulting in reduced lead time for assemblies and reduced inventory. If you can share the inventory across sites, you are going to end up scrapping less amount of single-use systems. And generally, there is a lot of discussion about single-use system sustainability and environmental impact. And by reducing the scrappage and improving process efficiencies, you can really positively impact environment. We've also learned through some data from some of us who have already implemented standard designs, some discussions we've had that utilizing standard designs, having standardized practices, reduced number of trainings because of more standard SKUs, all of this results in reduced defect across end user manufacturing operations. So there are a number of benefits that are possible through single-use standardization, and obviously there are some trade-offs as well as part of this discussion. Achieving standardization does require modular designs, and it may mean you will require more number of SKUs, more number of connections per process. And it's something that you'll have to watch out where it makes sense to modularize the designs and so on. Because these are standard designs, they are likely to be used across multiple sites, multiple programs, which means any change to a single-use assembly is going to get a little bit complicated, and you need to have a process that allows you to manage changes for impacted assemblies for multiple programs and multiple sites. With that, again, the end goal of this exercise was to achieve single-use resiliency. And one of the discussions we had early on was, why can't we achieve that without having standardized single-use systems? And we realized that because there are custom SKUs, each site would have site-specific procurement process uh, related to a program, related to a process, which would eventually mean limited quantity per SKU. And because you're ordering at a short notice or as needed basis, you will generally have a longer lead time. Um, there is also difficulty in inventory management and forecasting, because when you have process specific, scale specific, or site specific SKUs, and those priorities, if they change at end user, forecasting tied to such processes changes frequently, and it really makes it difficult to have a reliable forecast of single-use assemblies. And because they are custom assemblies, you cannot share those assemblies between the sites. One other thing that really stood out, especially during the COVID years, was if you had a really complex single-use assemblies, you are limited by supply of that complex assembly for any one key component, which may or may not be a component that a particular integrator or supplier themselves make it. For instance, you could have a mixing bag, or you could have any special assembly that could have a specific filter or a specific sensor or specific tubing, and one of those or any one of those components could restrict your ability to get that complex single-use assemblies from that integrator, even though 90% of base bag design or any base complex single-use assembly design is available to supply. You could restrict yourself of that complex design or bag assembly because of these components that are not available. And what that meant is a significant amount of resource that is available to supply single-use materials is really engaged in firefighting, meaning we know single-use components and the plastic resins, even though we think this is a significant market for us, in terms of actual volume of resin used in single-use materials is relatively small when you look at the polyethylenes or polypropylene supplies. And there is often an ongoing need to change resins, or resin is discontinued. And then there are many other reasons. We are all going through increased supply of single-use systems, additional sites being qualified. So a number of our resources are really spent on supporting those change notifications, component obsolescence, and multi-sourcing of components. And now when you think about having thousands of assemblies that are custom, that are really varying in really small amounts of lengths and tubing types or component type, and you end up supporting a lot of these ongoing lifecycle management tasks. And this takes away the amount of resources that are available to support long-term goals, which are improving the sustainability, ensuring supply, resiliency, and all of those things. And you really have difficulty achieving resiliency when you do not have a standard design, because you're focused on managing day-to-day tasks. So the next discussion we had was how can we achieve standardization, or what are the barriers to achieving standardization? And these are not necessarily the only barriers, but I would say these are some of the top things that we talked about. One of the key reasons that makes it difficult for end users to standardize designs is we have a mixture of number of manufacturing sites that may have started as stainless steel sites with a little bit of single use coming in. So those become hybrid. And then any new sites based on the scale of the process could be entirely single use and so on. So you basically have a number of different site layouts because of when they were established in the process scale and so on. And the image on the right-hand side just shows an example from ISPE paper where they talked about different layouts that are possible. This had to do with, there were a lot of open systems available a few years ago for manufacturing process, and there has been a number of single-use closed systems that are available that make it possible to now operate in controlled but non-classified areas. And the image on the top left in that chart shows most of your process equipment was within the clean room space. And as you implement more and more closed systems, you could go down to the right-hand side bottom design where you could have a lot of those systems in controlled unclassified spaces that utilized closed systems. So because of the scale, because of the amount of sites that we had, and because of the advent of single-use systems, there is a variety of manufacturing equipment layouts that each supplier or each end user currently possesses. So this poses a challenge that a standard design may fit one site, but it may not fit another site, especially if the design is complex. Now, add to that, you had a 10,000 liter process or a 2,000 liter process or a 5,000 liter process. The flow rates, the purification rates, the holdup volumes that are required for various intermediate steps, those also change quite a bit. And then for existing process, any change could result in regulatory filing changes. And this had to do with a lot of earlier filings that had very specific details in those filings. When going forward, maybe reducing some of the filing details to the critical information will allow us a little bit more freedom and flexibility. And on top of this, we're all trying to introduce new drug molecules. So where does the priority for standardization stand amongst all of those goals? Capital investment required, people resources, and so on. So these were some of the barriers to standardization that we talked about. And eventually, we realized that you cannot change the capital sites that easily without significant investment. But by designing modular single-use systems, you can break down complex single-use assemblies into smaller subsets. And the images on the right-hand side are some examples of it. You could have a bag with really minimal tubing on it. That could be the openings on the bags could be used to connect sample bags or filters or any sensor, whatever key functional requirement is. By doing so, you're achieving a couple of things. You're able to ensure that the bag assemblies or any single-use assembly is simple enough that the supplier of that specific bag technology, mixer, bioreactor, or storage, they could still supply all those equipments or single-use systems to you without being constrained by the filter assemblies or sample bags or any other sensor assemblies. And one of the key components that you want to standardize on is an aseptic connector. You could have a number of these assemblies, and if you have a variety of different aseptic connectors, you are likely to require multiple assemblies to connect them. So it doesn't have to be a gendered or genderless. You can adopt any approach you like, but standardize on something that allows you to have interchangeable or connectivity between different assemblies without having to require multiple versions of those. And then you could also create single-use systems per platform site. So you could have a number of single-use assemblies that support a 2,000-liter process, a number of assemblies that support a 500-liter process.
So I'm going to talk to you about the organizational support that can be put in place to help achieve standardization. As Monica and Viswash mentioned, early attempts to try and standardize single-use system in the industry was not successful due to there being too many differences across the industry. However, the outcome of that conversation and those activities was that if each organization could standardize internally, then they would start to feel the benefits of standardization and start to move the needle forward for standardizing across the industry. And one way to establish standardization within a biomanufacturer's organization is to establish a centralized design authority team. So this is a dedicated team that can drive the initiative and provide the governance for achieving standardization within an organization. Over the next few slides, I will describe in a bit more detail who the design authority are and what they need to be successful. So the design authority should be made up of a cross-functional team. Some of these functions may be core to the team and others may be ad hoc, supporting the team at different stages of its life cycle. There should be a strong technical representation on the team, and core functions would include single-use systems, subject matter experts, and engineering functions to really support the standardization initiatives. Depending on your organization terminology and the roles and responsibilities, some or maybe all of these functions may be needed, including technical services, technical operations, and operations. But the core is that the functions provided will understand the process and have hands-on experience using the single-use systems. There may also be advantage in having material scientists involved in the team, especially at the early stage when the design phase is being established and the polymers are being chosen. They'll be able to support with their subject matter expertise and provide supporting studies where needed. Procurement would be core to a team. So procurement would be that interface between the end user and the suppliers. And as Monica mentioned, to have a successful standardization program, you do want to work in close collaboration with the suppliers. The supply chain management function would be important to ensure the robust supply chain and logistics of getting in the single-use systems. And then, of course, quality would be an important function on the team to ensure that all the processes and designs meet your internal quality standards. So these are just some examples of a cross-functional team. There may be others that make sense in your organization to have on that team. The team should also have cross-site representation, and this is to ensure alignment across the network, to ensure that there's visibility across the sites, and to be able to provide that interaction from one site to another. The design authority should really have oversight of the single-use system design activities at each site within the network, either by collaboration with individuals at the site or representation of site members on that centralized design authority team. The image on the left shows how the centralized design authority could collaborate with sites to govern the standardization process. However, this might become cumbersome in a very large organization when there's a lot of end users, and the centralized design authority may become a bit of a bottleneck. In which case, the schematic on the right shows how each site could potentially establish its own site design authority, so that each site can govern its own process, and as needed, items can be escalated to the centralized design authority team. Having the site design authority representative on that centralized team will also ensure the cross-site representation. Whichever model suits your organization, the design authority should act as gatekeepers for the introduction of new single-use systems, ensuring that the requester first explores existing designs within the network before proliferating designs that are similar, as Monica mentioned, and all of the associated inefficiencies that come with that. So for standardization to be successful, dedicated resources are recommended, which needs commitment from the senior levels of the organization. Depending on where your company is in the journey, this could be a heavy lift, and having those dedicated resources is really important. This may not be successful if it's somebody's part-time job. And some of the first tasks and roles that the design authority would have would be to establish the tools for success for standardization. One of the first tools that's very useful for potentially establishing is the single-use user requirement specification. This is a document that captures all of the requirements of the single-use system in one location. It captures the functional, the quality, the regulatory requirements that the single-use system needs to meet. BioPhorum does have a template for this and are actually in the process of updating that template. Version 2 should be ready by the end of semester 1, so putting in a plug there. And the version 2 should align or will align with the Annex 1 requirements. So that will ensure that as you're using the requirement spec, that the requirements meet those Annex 1 needs. Another important tool that would be very valuable for the design authority to establish in collaboration with the digital functions is having a digital library and/or database. So oftentimes, again, depending on where your organization is in its journey, there may be a lot of single-use system designs throughout the network. These may be located on different desktops. They may be scanned in PDF format that are difficult to find and search. So having a centralized library with the drawings that are easy to find, easy to search based on the bill of material, is very advantageous. It's a very useful tool for sites to be able to look to see what is existing in the network and consider those before redesigning something very similar. Every time a new drawing comes in, there's likely to be a qualification process within your organization, and with that comes a lot of documentation, including validation guides and data sheets, extractable guides, and supporting studies. And again, having a central location for this documentation is very valuable for the end user who's looking to use an existing design. Another important tool for the design authority to establish early on is really defining what that design space looks like. Viswash mentioned a lot of these components, but understanding what your supplier can provide and where your design space should sit is an important task for the design authority. As Monica mentioned, there is a lot of components on the market, and shrinking that design space will reduce the variability across your network. Aligning on a single connector will allow the modularity and connectivity across the network. Trying to make changes to hardware is not very feasible given the large capital costs. However, if the opportunity presents itself, the design authority should be in a position to be able to guide the users to preferred platforms. So having them all established early on is very useful for ensuring standardization. As the tools are developed, the design authority can then start to build the process and proceduralizing what that will look like to ensure that everybody across the network is searching for in the same way, implementing and qualifying single-use systems in the same way. For example, if an end user identifies the need for a new single-use system, they should potentially be guided to complete the user requirements specification document to capture their needs. Then they could be led to the library to see if an existing design is already available to meet their needs. If it does, well then happy days, you're already realizing the benefits of this initiative. If nothing exists, well, then they should be guided towards the design space and the best practices for designing the custom item. Understanding the roles of each of the members of the team is also important. Is it procurement that's going to be responsible for going out to the suppliers to get the drawings? Will the design authority be the ultimate sign-off on drawings? Each of these items need to be worked out within the process. As the journey advances, and you're asking people to bring in new processes, change the way they're doing things, it will be important for the design authority to come up with a robust communication plan and train and educate the different users across the site for the best practices of how to work through the process. Implementation of standard single-use system designs requires robust procedures from selection right the way through to qualification, implementation, and change management. The design authority team need to decide where their focus will ultimately be. Should they look prospectively at new processes coming into site? Oftentimes, this has much more flexibility for embedding standardization in versus retrospectively looking at already well-established commercial products, which may have challenges with filing implications or just don't have the appetite for change. So understanding where to start focusing the standardization efforts, what bite-sized pieces to take out of that. The team should also ensure that there's sustainability within the different tools established. So I mentioned the database and the documentation. This needs to be kept up to date and current for end users to ensure that they're receiving the value of those tools. As designs are being replicated across the network and existing designs are being used at different sites, the idea of changing a design may become more complex. So the team need to work with the system owners to ensure that there's a robust global change management process in place so that every user is able to sign off on a change if it's necessary. And really central to the success of this whole initiative is establishing a dedicated team that can drive this forward. This team will have to measure their success and ensure that they're reinforcing the benefits to bring the organization along with them. And this will be a journey. It's not something that can be established overnight. This will take many months, if not years, to establish the tools and the processes and to get the buy-in across the organization. So I just say, don't wait for perfection. Just get started. You'll start to realize the benefits of this and move your organization forward for standardization.
Thanks, Louisa. So what I'm going to cover in these last few slides are just some of the considerations discussed in the paper as either a new facility, a new site, or an existing company that is trying to, I suppose, implement a standardized design. Some of these have been discussed already as we've gone through the presentation, so I won't labor them too much, but it's just to give people an idea of why we are considering these elements when moving towards standard design. So, as discussed by Jennifer there, the centralized design authority is probably one of the most crucial roles in moving towards standardized design. This team provides essentially a gatekeeping function to prevent the proliferation of alike designs that can lead to quite significant bloat within a company and can, I suppose, significantly increase the workload associated with just maintaining the assemblies within a network, never mind making improvements, understanding qualification activities that we'd like to be doing with our time. What I would also say to the centralized design authority is that this gives personnel within companies an avenue to work towards using standardized designs where they are existing designs that are available to use, are fit for purpose, or in some cases are very similar but require slight modifications or changes within a company. More often than not, the path of least resistance is to create a new consumable that is 90% similar under a new part number because it's the easier process. Vendors are able to offer a wide variety of solutions and able to turn around new designs very quickly. But by having the central design authority, people, either engineers, your technical service reps, quality, procurement, whoever's involved in the process, have a central group who are typically SMEs within the area who they can reach out to and discuss these changes and make it easier for a technical representative to use an existing design rather than going down the age-old route of creating a new assembly that's 90% the same. Also discussed in the paper and discussed by Vishwa as well is modular design. This approach is generally strongly recommended. What it gives us is a breakdown of complex single-use assemblies, breaking out the individual components as discussed. So moving away from bags, filters, sensors, all within one assembly, and breaking that down into 2, 3, 4 assemblies as required using a standardized genderless connection. What this gives us is it gives us interchangeability of the components. So where we have 4 components, and when I say components now, single-use sub-assemblies, it gives us the ability to use those across other assemblies. So we may break that, a bag with a filter and a sensor and a transfer line down into 4 components. That bag then goes from being multiple bags with multiple different filters and sensors into one standard bag, ideally, that the company uses. And then, depending on the requirements of the process, can attach, a different filter or a different sensor or a different transfer length line, depending on the required process step that it's being used for, without the need to create a new assembly altogether just for that slight change, either in filter or length of tubing. This obviously has its own risks compared to, I suppose, a fully integrated solution. It does introduce the potential for increased leaks, depending on how many additional connections. But in general, the connectors provided within the industry are well established, they're well used, people that can have very good experience with them, and sufficient training within a company can typically mitigate any of these risks. Next then that we discussed in the paper is, I suppose, for standard single-use implementation is the structured process. So it's strongly recommended that a URS is developed, whether you are a new site who's, I suppose, building up their catalog of single-use assemblies, or you're an old site that's trying to, I suppose, whittle down the complex availability of assemblies that are within a network that need to be managed. The first step is developing a process and a URS to outline, what are going to be your preferred connectors, your preferred tubing, your preferred equipment sets, and your available equipment sets in the case of an existing site. What's also very good when starting on this process is to, I suppose, set a boundary on it. At the end of the day, the goal should never be 100% standardization within a company. That's typically unfeasible. Depending on the process that you're running, each process can have its own kind of unique requirements. Equipment sets can have, specific design and connectors. And in some cases, it may not be feasible to create a standardized design across the board. And it's, I suppose, a good activity up front to identify where standardization doesn't add value, where actually it adds risk, or it's not feasible to, to get all your designs onto one standard bag or one standard filter because the process is not compatible with it. In that case, you can, quickly remove X% of your consumable catalog from scope, and it just gives you the opportunity to focus on the most value-adding areas for your standardization process. Next then, and we've discussed this as well so far in the various slides, is a centralized database. Whether you are, once again, a new site starting out or an existing site, understanding the catalog of consumables that you are introducing or have available is the first step. Typically, a lot of companies can rely on their suppliers to manage their drawings, their consumable bill of materials, the subcomponents, and this can be sufficient in, when you have a single facility, a single process, and you have a very small catalog consumables to work with. As this grows, it becomes very difficult to manage and understand what is available in the network. And that, as well, as we've discussed, becomes a hurdle to any attempt to, I suppose, implement a central design authority. But this database, depending on, the number of processes, the number of sites in your network, there's, different approaches that can be taken. Some people might look at a centralized database and say, oh, I need to get funding for a global tool. I need to go talk to companies externally that provide these offerings and understand our requirements. And while that generally might be the end goal and probably an ideal solution where you have multiple sites feeding into this and you want to have multiple workflows in the process at once, where a site is starting out, something as simple as an Excel may be sufficient. If you're only dealing with 100 assemblies, you have one facility or one site that's starting out. A simple approved Excel within a validated, document management system with a breakdown of your components, your drawing numbers, your drawing revision history, your drawing references, and your drawing, your approved drawing saved within that system as well, can provide a start, and it can allow people within a site to understand and readily respond to changes. A big part of that is that once you have a consumable approved, that isn't the end of the consumable's life. You will continue to receive supplier change notifications. You may need to make changes yourself from a qualification point of view, and understanding at a subcomponent level all those aspects of your consumables in a quick searchable database is going to be key. Next, then we have the regulatory challenges. So as sites kind of introduce single-use assemblies, they probably get requests either internally or externally from regulatory bodies to provide more and more information on the single-use assemblies. And what you discuss in the paper is, in general, it is better to use generic descriptions and focus on, I suppose, critical quality requirements of single-use materials where they are required by the process, rather than offering up standard low risk assemblies and their specific vendors, as some end users can be prone to do. The reason for this is any situation where we have a vendor or a part number or specific details of a consumable registered within a submission is always going to increase the challenge and the hurdle in going to standardization, because you're limited in the changes that you can make, whether you can change on certain vendors, or whether or not you can remove a consumable for a standardized consumable you've introduced in the process. So that's always a key consideration, either when you're starting a new submission or revising a submission. And then the final methodology we discussed from consideration point of view was hardware standardization. This is probably, as Vishwa has stated, probably the biggest challenge, especially for an existing site where typically capital has been invested, procedures and training has been completed for the equipment in use, and there's limited, to no appetite to go and spend capital investment on new equipment to facilitate this, standardization effort. To this, and what we discussed in the paper, is there's different levels that this can be approached as. Typically smaller items such as pumps and welders, they have a slightly more limited lifetime. There's smaller capital associated with them, and it's an easier, I suppose, sell internally to possibly swap these out to a standardized design, allowing you then to move to standardized tubing brands, diameters, or depending on the equipment set that you're discussing, and maybe saving some of the more significant hardware such as the single-use mixers or single-use bioreactors, if the case may be, for later processes, or maybe saying, what, they fall into our small subset that we're going to say are not worth the value benefit for going towards standardization. So there are the methodologies discussed in the paper. As we were putting these slides together, we kind of discussed, what are probably some of the high key points depending on if you're a new facility or if you're an existing facility, because they are slightly different approaches, but at the same time, they must take in the same consideration. So if you are starting up a new facility within a network, there's no consumables within your site or facility to date that you have to consider. Great, that's the best start you can ask for after this presentation today. Generally, what we'd say there is that single-use designs and discussions with your single-use engineer or technical representative, whoever they might be, should start at a site either profiling or equipment selection phase. A lot of the times your single-use designs are going to be locked the minute you pick your hardware or you pick your facility floor plan, and that is going to limit a lot of the single-use elements. There are, I suppose, Some examples to consider there is that your pumps are going to limit what tubing you can use. And in some cases, if you're using, bag holders, whether it be fixed or mobile bag holders for your process intermediates or your ancillary feeds, decisions can be made to go with certain hardware vendors depending on a selected single-use bag. And you may not realize that within the supplier network, there are different design that are typically used for the bag chambers. There's not one standard design, but some vendors do align more than others, so that those hardware selections can limit your ability to second source, move between vendors in response to any supply or changes within your process. Where you're a new site within an existing network, it'd be great if you had a central design authority, but in lacking that, starting with networking within your company to say, okay, can we get a central design authority up and running, or what kind of options do we already have approved offsite or site, and what suppliers are used, what connections, and can we get to the stage where we can use some of their assemblies within our site? And then finally, engage with vendors early. A lot of projects can proceed with, this is our design, the consumables work themselves out at the end. And while in most cases, your vendors, suppliers can offer, a wide array of catalog items and customized items and, more components than you can imagine under the sun, just because they are all available doesn't mean they're right for you. So understanding what your operational needs are, as well as what the vendors' lead times are, the cost of individual components. We talked a lot about preferred components. Working with your vendors to create, I suppose, assemblies that work for you while using their preferred components, can pay dividends in the long run from a lead time and a cost point of view. Then we talked, about an existing facility and what might be different there. So this comes back to what we discussed in the methodologies there, which is very much understanding the scope of what you're trying to tackle. So a comprehensive assessment of what are the current materials, what are any challenges we have in materials, is there any external regulatory changes that are going to drive sudden changes in materials, are there any materials we know that are going to be stopped production, and are there any materials that we just know we can't change, whether it be from a hardware requirement or from a regulatory submission point of view. And then moving on to a clear single-use strategy off the back of that. So we've lived in a world of customized designs. Each application gets its own tailored fit, and we're now in the case of several hundred assemblies. We now need to backpedal all that and understand, how do we move towards modular design? What are our preferred components? What qualification data do we already have in-house versus what qualification data would we need to gain to produce if we were to move from one standard component to another? And then finally, executing stages. When you're an existing facility, you have many consumables, you have quite a large stock of those consumables. For some companies that can be in the millions of materials stored on site. And as well, you're running, like, the processes are coming in and out. You're not going to take downtime to execute a project like this. So understanding, where are the low risk areas, can I go after my ancillary points in the process, some of my feed areas, and their preparations where it's limited impact, lower risk, and easier to standardize design. Start there, see how that works out, and then move on to the more complicated, your upstream or your downstream, your process points at a later date. And always taking that point of view that sometimes standardization isn't the right solution, and it just needs to, remove a few consumables from the scope. Final slide now, and then you'll be done with me. So I suppose considerations then, if you have managed to kick off a central design authority at your site, either for a new site, or you've managed to work one site backward, one site into an improved state. There's probably a few considerations then is, where do we go next? So which is the considerations for scaling out. In an ideal world, if you have multiple sites within a company, you would all be working off a single design authority with standardized designs for, say, 80% of your consumables that are all shared and second sourced, and you have inventory that you understand, that it can be interchanged between processes. So the first step is always going to be to expand your centralized design authority to the new sites. This is using the established framework, and as Jennifer has discussed, potential considerations for a hybrid model where you have central design authorities at 2 sites with a governing central design authority that's really only required when, the primary user of a consumable, and in most cases we should always get to the point that multiple sites are the primary user, but where one site requires a change to an existing consumable and is trying to put that through rather than creating a new consumable within the network, at that higher level of central design authority could facilitate that change across 1, 2, 3 sites, whatever it might be. Leverage existing knowledge. So this is very much that when you've worked through the exercise and you're bringing new sites on board, it's using those documentations, those procedures, those URs that you've developed to share that with the new site, help them understand the existing assemblies that we have done from a standardization point of view, and really challenge the existing designs, new designs, with the goal that we're minimizing any redesign as the standardization is, scaled out to other facilities. And it just, to repeat those proven methodologies, once again, going back to the slides and the paper that we discussed in the selection of equipment and components and procedures. As always, balancing the risk of standardization for efficiency must be, I suppose, balanced against the risk of not. So where we are moving towards standardization, these are changes, we will require additional qualification, the introduction of new connections, processes. Those will always introduce a risk, but it must be considered against the risks of not changing as the sites continue to grow and we see bloat and unique assemblies and tailored assemblies for every single use within a business. Those bring their own risks, primarily driven from the requirements to manage and maintain them and respond really to external changes that you have no control over. There's many benefits that we've discussed throughout today from both supplier and end users viewpoints. Some of these key benefits are the modular approach. Where you have a modular design, it can really reduce down the need for a custom design every time a facility comes online or a process comes online, with the ideal state that being when a new process or a new site is introduced, there is an existing catalog of standard modular designs that can be put together to create any requirement that your network or process has. As you scale out, this approach, it's a snowballing effect. So the first activation energy is always going to be the largest because you have to move several hundred bespoke assemblies down to 100 standard modular designs. But as you roll that out for new processes, new facilities within a site, or to new sites, you should see less and less need for qualification activities, design, engagement with vendors, because you'll start to realize we've created the full catalog of what we need in a standardized approach. And those benefits of having that standard design across all the sites start to compound as well. So as you move to a network-wide approach, all of your benefits start to increase, because if you're working off a standard design and your components are interchangeable between sites, you naturally gain shared stock. So you can reduce the amount of stock, redundant stock or safety inventory that you require on a site, because other sites within the network have safety stock as well. It simplifies second sourcing. If you're dealing with 100 consumables instead of 300 consumables, that's a much bigger activity to go after from a second sourcing point of view, which is another avenue for supply resiliency. And reducing the number of assemblies, it leads to cost savings just through the management of the lifetime of those consumables, as we've discussed. Once they're approved and in use, you're still going to be receiving changes both from vendors and regulatory bodies that are going to drive workload, and having less consumables to manage and more knowledge of the consumables that you do have is going to reduce that effort and exercise.
I'll keep it brief, but in general, you learned a lot about what supplier perspective is, what end user advantages and challenges are, and different ways to get to the end result of standardization. So I would say if you have CDA, connect with them. If not, start on your own journey, and together you need to discover a solution that meets your own individual site or company requirements. And once you've discovered a solution or a path forward, you can accelerate your journey by proactively engaging with both internal stakeholders and external supply partners. And certainly for additional discussions and insights, please reach out to Lucia, and then some of us can also join for further discussions.
So yeah, thank you so much for attending and participating today. Thank you ever so much to our panel of speakers for all their efforts in writing the paper and obviously giving up their time today to talk to you all about it.